e5, knight c3, knight f6, white plays pawn to f4. So this is the Vienna Gambit. In previous videos we went through bishop c5. We'll still probably go one more time through bishop c5 in the next video. I'm preparing quite a lot of them. Today we're just going through what happens after the pawn takes the pawn in f4. This happens a lot in blitz, and to those who don't know the Vienna very well, it's important to know, not because we're going to consider blunders, but rather because we're going to understand the positions that can arise. I consider this video very important to go through the next Vienna games because we understand all the threats that are going on. Right now, the best move by black is d5. This is the main line. We're going to go through that in the next video. Let's look at what happens after pawn takes. This happens a lot. Right now, we can push the pawn in e5. The knight cannot go to d5 or e4 because of the knight, cannot go to g4 or h5 because of the queen. So the knight is forced to go back. There's a move that sometimes is played, but that also loses to a bad game, which is queen to e7, pinning the pawn. Now, white plays queen e2, which pins the pawn in e5, and now the knight really has to go to g8. Any other move, we will just take the knight. It's completely free. So knight goes to g8, only move, and now we have to play a very important move to understand the Vienna. Knight f3, you have to play it when the queen can go to h4, which isn't right now not really that much of a threat, but it kind of saves black from the really bad game. Queen h4 is a typical pattern when the pawn in f4 guarding the g3 square, meaning that we will have to either swap pieces or move the king. We don't want any of that. Knight f3 develops the knight, protects the square h4. Right now, black is already in big trouble. He cannot develop. The knight had to go back to his own place. And the pawn in d6 cannot develop to allow the bishop out, for example, because now knight d5 wins immediately. Knight d5, and the queen will have to move. When the queen goes, let's say d7, we can take this pawn. It's a check with the queen, and the king moving will allow pawn taking here with check, and that's going to be game over because the queen will have to sacrifice. Queen takes, and then we can take it. So after d6, knight d5, if the queen goes back here, we have the same pattern. We take the pawn, and then according to how the game goes, we will still be able to play like knight c7 check, winning another pawn and the rook. And of course, black cannot block in any way. Let's say bishop e7, we still have access to c7, and bishop and knight. Let's say bishop e7. Then again, we just take the pawn and then the rook. The option of king moving is even worse because of knight e5 check, and that's if the king takes the pawn, then knight f7 wins the queen, and then king going back is a suicide. So for example, king goes back, then knight c7 comes, it's check, and king can't move anywhere, so black has to give up the queen. So let's recap. Now after knight f6, f4, a very common mistake is to take the pawn. It will happen also in blitz more often. e5 met by the move queen e7, then we just unpin the pawn, the knight is forced to go back, only move, otherwise you can just take it. Knight f3, and now we went through d6, is completely wrong. g6 is also wrong because it creates a weakness on the square f6. So now we can play knight d5 again, and so that the queen can't go anywhere on this diagonal, or well, anywhere on this diagonal except the square c5. The queen can't go to c5. Let's get there in a second. Let's see what happens after queen d8. Our threat is to play knight f6 check. And now if knight takes, we take back, comes with the check, we're covering the square e7 with the pawn, which means we're going to win another piece. Right, so the bishop will have to get in there. And then with a clean piece up. So again, after queen d8, we have a threat of knight f6. What happens after knight f6? King goes back, king goes to e7. We play b3. And the game is compromised forever. This pawn cannot push, otherwise we can take with this cover check. And of course we're happy to sacrifice the knight. Potentially king f6 would be met by queen e5, which is checkmate. So white dominates the game after moving the bishop out. Best move by black obviously is c5, blocking the entire diagonal where the bishop wanted to go and contribute to the attack on the king. Now white continues with knight to e4. And our idea is to play d4 as soon as we can. There really is no way to continue this game. The position is evaluated by the engine with about something +8, and you can tell why. I mean, black hasn't been able to develop anything. White's just going to swap the central pawn and develop the bishops, and that will come with a deadly attack. Right, back at the position, after knight is forced to g8, knight f3, we went through g6 and also realized that was wrong, and then knight d5, we need to go through queen c5. But after queen c5, the king has an escape in a square d8, and the move knight f6 doesn't work. So our strategy here is very simple. We protect the knight by playing queen e4. Now we have a threat of playing d4, which is deadly attack. Not to mention that the position is just completely winning. d4 threatens to remove the queen away from the c7 square. Well, lots of squares are just not accessible because of the knight, the bishop, the queen. None of these squares is actually accessible. The queen can't really go back, and after a move like queen to c6, then we can really force the queen away by playing bishop to b5. If the queen takes the bishop, knight c7 recaptures the queen, and if the queen moves away, then we can just go to c7 and win a lot of material. So we do have a threat of playing d4. So the best move by the black player now is bishop to a6, which protects the square c7 a little bit further, and the best move by white is to take the knight. So now pawn takes back, and we end the game with knight f6, which is a check, and we can take the rook. So if the king moves, we just take the rook, and if the knight takes the knight instead, we simply take the knight first because it comes with a check, and then we carry on. In this position, right after black moved the knight back to g8, only move, knight f3, black plays, let's say, this very normal move, but that's also, the game is compromised, as we mentioned. d4 now, simply we are taking the center, and we have a threat of d5. Black cannot stop that threat because d6 will come with the usual knight d5. And then the pawn can take with the discovered check, and then we have an access to c7. So we can look at two different type of ideas now. b6 to get the bishop out and maybe castle longside, because the black player is never going to castle a kingside. It's just not going to be able to. Now we can play d5. We have double attack on the square e5, so the knight can't take. Knight d4 will be taken. So after knight moves, we can attack it again, and after knight is forced back, we simply take the pawn back in f4, and now we carry on with the plan of long castling. So what can black do? Well, basically nothing. A move like d6 is just met by long castling, and then the plan is to play queen to d2, swap the central pawn, and exploit this very weak queen. The position is amazing. A move like bishop b7, carrying on with development and maybe going for the ambition of castling, is met by long castling, and after finally long castling, white plays queen to d2 with the idea of playing d6, crashing move. Obviously taking the pawn will be a suicide. After taking back, we will be having full control of the square c7. We're going to infiltrate our pieces. Knight b5, queen c3 would be potential ideas depending on how it goes. So a move like d6 is met by bishop to b5, and the idea is to develop the rook to the e file, swap the central pawn, and attack the whole file where the queen is. This is happening inevitably because either we will take or they will take us. If this pawn takes, for example, also in order to allow the knight from going out, because the king side is just completely trapped, then we just play knight to e5. And yeah, let's just cut this line because it's more about learning the positions and the weaknesses of the black player that can arise in this game rather than memorizing lines. But it's good to familiarize with the Vienna Gambit, and well, to be honest, these mistakes happen a lot, especially in blitz. So let's recap once again. After f4, if pawn takes and pawn goes up, look, we're not going to go through queen e7. I think I've given way too many examples of this line. So let's go to knight to g8 immediately back. Now we play knight to f3. The idea of the black player after taking this pawn, the pawn in f4, is to keep the pawn advantage forever. So now we're going to be talking about all the sacrifices that are available simply because of the development advantage. Right now, black can choose to play the move g5, thematic. Right now, white plays the move d4. We take control of the center. And the idea of the black player with playing such a move is to attack the knight with g4. There could be other moves, but let's go to the most classical one, which is g4. That's the theory. g4 is met by bishop takes f4, completely careless of the knight. Pawn taking the knight is met by queen takes. So this is a position that you might be slightly familiar with, but let's see how to exploit it properly, because the good thing about the Vienna game is that it gets incredibly sharp. But also the negative thing is that if you make one simple mistake, then you lose the whole game because you're gambling a lot of stuff. Queen f3, black continues with knight to c6. It would be pointless to play a move like f6 to try and develop the knight here because it's a bit of a hope move. Also, that kind of move is often met with queen to h5, giving a check. This is a very weak diagonal. Knight c6 makes more sense, attacks this pawn, and now white continues with bishop c4. So again, we just ignore this. Right now, white has a threat. If white were to move again, he will play bishop f7 check, and then the bishop will go and check and take the queen. So king takes, bishop wins the queen. The knight going to f6 doesn't help because you can just take. And if the king doesn't take the bishop after the check, then you can force it with knight d5. The king has to go to the only square, taking the bishop, and then the same thing is going to happen. So we have this amazing threat. Black has to play though. The best move by black is d5, which is also thematical in these situations. Let's have a quick look at queen e7, which puts more protection over the square f7. We will just long castle. We're defending the pawn, we no longer have to worry about that pawn. Moves like d6 are just punished because you can take and then the rook is going to pin the queen. And especially the king side is never going to be able to be good. So black gambles the safety of the king side in order to win a knight in f3, but then he can't castle anymore. Black will not be able to push this pawn in order to develop this bishop to a normal square and then castle the king long side. Simply because then the rook will be able to pin the queen, and also it would be impossible to think of castling king side. It looks terrible, and well, what are you going to do? Bishop g7, and then where are you going to put the knight to h6? You can survive a little bit longer, but white will have too much pressure on f7 when the rook is coming to f1. So let's go to the other line. Instead of queen e7, as we said, the best move is d5. So d5, we take en passant. Black has several ways to take back. Best one is to take with the bishop, because you don't want to isolate your own pawn, and the bishop comes, it's developing, and black is having some dreams of maybe playing the knight somewhere, maybe castling, at least not block the queen, and also maybe looking for swaps in a game where the development is so much better for white. Now we still sacrifice. Bishop takes, and after king takes, bishop g5, black plays knight to f6. And seems like the bishop is attacking it, but it's two pieces, but there's two pieces defending. So how does white continue? We keep putting pressure on the pinned piece, of course. We never take a pinned piece. So now we have three pieces attacking the knight. We're going to be able to take the knight with a crashing attack. The other rook is coming. The knight can jump to lots of excellent squares. So after bishop e7, giving more protection to the knight, white continues with knight to d5. The queen cannot take the knight, because then we can take the queen for free. In fact, this knight will be pinned by the rook. The knight cannot take obviously because it's pinned. Best move by black according to the engine is bishop g4, obviously to deflect the queen. We can take the bishop for free, the knight is pinned, but then the queen can take our knight, and the black player is releasing a lot of pressure on the pinned piece. So now white continues with queen to e4. We still defend the knight, we don't release the pressure over this pin. Now we have three pieces attacking f6, and black cannot defend it any longer with any other piece. This rook here is unable to help. Now we have an idea of taking everything, right? Because we've got three pieces, black has three pieces, but one of them is the queen, so we'll be happy to swap everything. So for example, if king goes to g7 with the idea of playing the rook to f8, it's just too late. White will play rook takes bishop. And then bishop takes will be met by bishop takes f6 with a check. It's defended by the knight. We're going to win the queen. And if rook takes knight and then black doesn't take back, but rather plays rook f8, then queen to g4. And we're just threatening a lot of nasty discover checks here. So if bishop takes rook, then bishop takes comes with a check by the queen as well. So we're going to win a lot of material like the queen. And if queen takes knight, for example, bishop h6, king goes back, we have a checkmate in g7. King takes rook, and we have a checkmate happening after rook f1. King can't go anywhere, he's going to have to block with a queen. Then we can just take. So from the beginning, this f4 and pawn takes is punished. Knight goes back to g8, knight f3, then g5, we play d4. And this idea, we just ignore the knight. Pawn takes, queen takes, knight c6 is met by bishop c4. We've talked about the threat we're making. So best move is d5, we take en passant, bishop takes back, we take, king takes, bishop g5 is met by knight f6, and then we castle. Then bishop e7, and then we attack the knight further. Best move is bishop g4, and we stay on the same diagonal of the knight, but we keep pinning the knight in f6, except we are using a lower value piece, which is great. As we talked about, king g7 is met by rook f6, it's disaster. The best move by black is bishop to e6. White continues by taking the bishop in e7. And now there's just too much attack on f6. Best move by black is to take the pawn in d4, swapping pieces in order to give himself some freedom, some peace. Queen takes and knight takes. All moves are forced. Now white continues with bishop to f6. It's a fork. And now the knight might jump to e2, but after moving the king, we will eventually play rook a to e1 anyway, attacking the knight. So we'll just go straight to this variation, the rook getting safe from the bishop. Now we play rook a to e1. If the knight had gone and done that check, we would have played rook a1 just the move later, and the knight would be in trouble because he would be trapped. So as a matter of fact, knight e2 wasn't the best move. Rook a to e1, and right now there's plenty of options, all of them losing. The black player might try to grab the rook for 2 pieces, so rook takes is met by bishop takes knight, comes with a check, and after king goes back, bishop to c5 attacks the rook, and the rook will now have to move somewhere. Whatever, we're going to take the bishop for free, and if the rook stays there, we're going up the exchange in the endgame, and an extra pawn, we're winning the endgame. So same position, if black takes the pawn with the knight with an attack on the rook, we play bishop g5, comes with a check. The king will have to move nowhere on this file, so he's got to go to g7, and now rook e6. We're saving the rook and winning the piece. One last recap. Play f4, if they take, you push the pawn, knight g8, knight f3, and the black player thinks he might be able to hold this pawn forever, but that's not happening. d4, g4, we ignore the knight, and after losing the knight and knight c6, we said we play bishop c4 with all the threats. What happens after a move like knight to d4? Let's quickly mention the bishop f7 applies here as well. King f7, queen h5 comes with a check, and king e7 comes with bishop g5, which wins too much stuff. Bishop g7, king to g7 is met by simply castling. Now we have a threat of playing bishop to e3, and we have this attack on f7. It's impossible for the knight to go to f6 to try and trade because there's a pawn in e5, and the black player might think that he's just losing the piece that he won before, so we will be equally material, except that this king is looking terrible. A move like bishop to c5 is with the threat of discover attack is still pointless because we're going to play queen to g4 check. The king can't go to this file, he will have to go to the f file, and after that we have discover check with the bishop that is deadly. So let's have a look at this other scenario. After f4, pawn takes, and then we attack the knight, and the knight goes back, knight f3. They might not go for the plan of g5. They might play a normal move like d6. Here we still play d4. Right now black is up a pawn, but he has sacrificed tempos and development. We're also attacking the pawn in f4. Going for g5 now wouldn't change anything because it's a similar scenario to before, so you can just go on with the regular moves. As I mentioned in every one of my videos, we're not memorizing lines, but rather familiarizing with patterns. You might argue that this video is about an opening that will not happen very often, but I actually argue that it will happen a lot of times, especially in blitz. Now the black player might think of taking the pawn in order to consolidate the advantage of a pawn. He goes up a pawn, well, he goes up 2 pawns, and he might not feel like he's got any problem developing eventually. So if the pawn takes, we ignore that, and we play queen e2, and now we're pinning this pawn. We're down 2 pawns right now, but we are developing. Right now it's impossible for black to keep control of the pawn in e5. If black were to be so stubborn, he would play f6, but it wouldn't make any sense because we're still going to take, and then we have just so much better development. And anyway, let's play this bishop e7 move, because that's the best move according to the computer. Black needs to immediately develop because he's so behind with that. So after bishop e7, best move, we take the pawn in e5. And after black plays knight f6, finally dreaming to be able to castle, we play bishop f4. Right now we've equalized the pawn, so we're equal, and we're trying to go and take the pawn in c7. If black were to castle, our best move would be queen takes c7, winning a pawn. There's no compensation for black with that. So after the best move by black, which is c6, stopping that, we play bishop to c4. And now black castles. So in this scenario, what have we earned? It looks like the black player managed to take the pawn in f4 and got away with it, but actually we've got better development. In fact, now we're going to castle, and it's black to move. The reason why we have an advantage now, great advantage actually, even though the material is equal, is that we're pinning this f7 pawn forever. This pawn will not be able to move because of the well-known weakness of the plan of knight g5 within the bishop together, this sort of fried liver attack looking. This pawn here is pinned and it will be forever. Moves like knight to d7 attacking the queen are not a problem. We go back to e2. Black will not be able to deflect this bishop from c4. So for example, b5 is met by bishop b3, a4 is met by rook a2 e1. We're putting double attack on the bishop. That's one of the thematic moves here, and black will have to move the bishop, but where d6 is occupied, so is c5, and the only one will be b4, but that will allow us to attack the bishop with an attack, and that also gives a shelter for our bishop. So if the bishop forced to take the knight, we can take back. These pawns here are not going anywhere, and our bishop is safe no matter what. So now a move like rook to e8 to protect the bishop a little bit further is met by knight to g5, ending the game. There is no defense against this weakness of f7. Going back a few moves, after knight d7 and queen goes back to e2, black, you might think that black can save himself with a move like h6, but that doesn't help. The d pawn is gone. That means that we have an attack on f7, not only by knight to g5, but also by knight to e5. After h6, white continues with rook a to e1, applying pressure on this bishop. And a move like rook to e8 is now met by, again, knight e5, going for this weakness. And trading doesn't help the black player, because now we take back with the bishop, and now we have a plan of taking this knight. It would be great if we could. If it was our move, now we can do bishop takes knight. If bishop takes, we can win rook. And if pawn takes, then that's a disaster for the black king. So the best move by black now is rook back to f8. Now we proceed with queen to f3. The goal obviously is to play knight to e4, put more and more pressure on the f6 square, and exploit these fantastic bishops. After knight e4, we're not afraid of a swap. Of course, we're reducing the number of defenders around the king side. And with knight to e4, we're threatening to swap everything on the f6, bishop takes, and then black will either destroy the king side or suggest a swap with the queen. In that case, we will take it. We will infiltrate the rook and win material as well. And it's going to be a very easy endgame. If black tries the very logical bishop to g4, we play queen to g3, and now we have a very easy idea to just take the knight so we can take the bishop. So best move by black now is bishop to h5. Now white continues with rook to f4, the plan of doubling up the rooks. And black knight is pinned. He can't really move anywhere because we have a checkmate threat. And the suggested swap of bishops in order for black to try and release the pressure from the g7 square. So let's do it. Bishop d6 is met by rook h4. The bishop is not able to retreat because we can just take it for free. The pawn in f7 is pinned. The bishop can't take the bishop because we can take back with the pawn. He comes with an attack on the knight, whilst the rook is coming with an attack on the bishop. And in this position, the swap of bishop is not good. Let's try knight to e8, which protects g7. But this situation is terrible for black. Look at his rook. White now continues with knight to e4 and the plan of doubling up the rooks. Black is stuck in the same position where he can't really get rid of this very strong bishop. And yeah, so the plan is rook to f1, potentially rook to f5 attacking the bishop. And moves like moving the g pawn would be just insane. So after knight e4, a move like g5 is punished by queen to h3, attacking the bishop and infiltrating in h6 with the threat of queen h8. The pawn in f7 is pinned, and if the pawn takes the rook, then we just stay here with a mate, with a forced mate, considering that this pawn cannot move. We've got too many pieces attacking f6. Yes, it looks like the bishop can go to f6, but actually not, because he can just take it with the knight. You're just exploiting the g6 square. So knight takes, queen g6, and then you carry on. So a move like king h8, for example, unpinning the f7 pawn, is met by queen h3, and this pawn is now pinned. So we're going. This is a skewer. We're attacking both h5 and h6. We're going to be able to take h6. It's a disaster. Bishop can't block because we got another piece attacking h4, and king h7 is met by queen to d3, threatening a discovered attack, forcing the king back. The discovered attack is just too strong. If bishop g6, then simply bishop takes f7. We're going to get rid of this bishop. If the bishop takes, we've got knight check. It's double check. The king must go h8, and then we checkmate. If the rook takes, then we just go up a lot of material. The bishop can't take back for the same reason. Knight f6, king moves, and then mate. So after rook takes and rook takes, what happens if the king goes back to g8? Well, here comes this insanity of a move. Knight f6 check. Plenty of things are possible. If king takes rook, queen c4 comes with a check. Queen is forced to d5, we can take the queen. And if the king just moves back, we got a checkmate. If after the check the knight takes, then queen g6 is deadly. If after the check the bishop takes, then again queen g6. And we just go up with the exchange, more pawns, and crashing attack. We have an idea of playing rook to f1.